Hello, this is The Globalist, broadcasting to you live from Midori House in London. I'm Georgina Godwin. On the show ahead...
Yes, I want to step down Sheikh Hasina!
We'll begin with an update on the situation in Bangladesh, which worsened significantly over the weekend. We'll ask how long the Prime Minister can last in the face of demands for her resignation. Then who will be Kamala Harris's number two? As she interviews prospective candidates, we'll ask how the choice of vice presidential running mate might influence the race. Protests have rocked Nigeria. Is this unrest related to demonstrations in other parts of the continent? And could we be about to see a youth-driven African spring? Then...
I'm Manos Papavasiliou, and I'll be talking about this summer's Greek drama, as authorities tell locals to stay away from their own islands and give way to a record tourist influx.
Plus, we'll have a roundup of technology news, a flick through the papers, and finally, we'll cross to our Paris rooftop studio to hear what's in store from our colleagues covering the Olympics. And yes, Emma Nelson and I are particularly interested in the fate of one unfortunate pole vaulter. That's all ahead here on The Globalist, live from London. First, a look at what else is happening in the news. Ukrainian pilots have started flying F-16s for operations within the nation, President Volodymyr Zelensky said on Sunday, confirming the long-awaited arrival of the US-made fighter jets more than 29 months after Russia's full-scale invasion of the country. North Korean leader Kim Jong-un oversaw the delivery of 250 new tactical ballistic missile launchers to frontier troops, state media KCNA reported today, which Seoul said he would use to threaten South Korea. And a new wave of anti-immigration rioting has swept across several British cities following the murder of 3 girls in Southport. The riots sprang up after false information on social media spread that the subject was a radical Muslim migrant. Do stay tuned to Monocle Radio throughout the day for more on those stories. Now, in Bangladesh, demonstrators are demanding the resignation of the Prime Minister, Sheikh Hasina. Protests began last month with students calling for an end to a quota system for government jobs, and those demonstrations escalated into violence that have left more than 200 people dead. On Sunday, the government announced shops and businesses will be closed until Wednesday. Courts will be shut indefinitely, while mobile internet services were cut off and Facebook and messaging apps such as WhatsApp were inaccessible. At least 11,000 people have been arrested in recent weeks, and the unrest has also resulted in the closure of schools and universities across the country. At one point, the authorities imposed a shoot-on-site curfew. Well, joining me to discuss this is Dr. Ishrat Hossain, who's a researcher at the University of Oxford. Ishrat, many thanks for joining us. Now, we covered the beginning of these protests, which was all to do with government job quotas. Just remind us briefly of that original spark.
Thank you, Georgiana. So the original spark was a court decision that overruled the quota that were banned, or not banned, that were removed from the government job system. And the students who started protesting at the beginning of July, they were demanding that this decision regarding job quotas should be decided not in the courts, but with the executive branch of the government, and there should be a law that abolishes most of the quotas. They were actually demanding a reform to the system, so they didn't want to get rid of all the quotas, but their demand was that the quotas should be in line with the people, the disadvantaged population as described in the Constitution. So the government did not listen to them initially, and they just started pointing to the court, and they said that the court decision will be what the government will follow in the end.
So those protests, though, have grown. What's driving the protesters now? What do they want?
I think after 16th of July, when the government brutally cracked down on the peaceful protesters, that has become now a demand for, initially it was a demand for accountability and justice for the 200 people that were killed, as you mentioned, between 16th of July and 21st of July. So those 200 people that were killed, the protesters were enraged. The whole country was enraged because there were lots of young people. There were at least 32 children, as per UNICEF. So then it became a call for accountability and justice. But since the government did not stop or take any measures to address those grievances, it slowly transformed into this demand for the Hasina regime to step down.
So can you tell us what the situation on the street is now and how it escalated over the weekend?
I think the trigger for the escalation was the non-cooperation movement that the student platform has called. And they now are firm on one point demand, which is the resignation of the prime minister. And in retaliation, now the government is saying that there is no situation that the government should resign, and they will use all their power to control the situation. That is the rhetoric, that they will use what they have to calm down the situation, to take out the third-party forces that have infiltrated the protest movement. So with that narrative, now the government is kind of trying to take control of the streets with their own student wing who are armed, and they're also using, in some parts, the police. But it's mainly now a face-off between the workers of the ruling party, Awami League, and the student protesters.
And is this stoked by any political party from the student side?
That is the narrative that the government is trying to say, that the opposition party and Bangladesh Nationalist Party, BNP, and their allies, Islamist political party, Jamaat-e-Islami, they are taking they're taking advantage of the situation, and they're sabotaging or kind of hijacking the whole movement. But what we have seen in the last a couple of weeks, that the opposition has been quite silent in a way, and they have not come out in full force as they had come out in the past. So it seems that this is an organic movement, and the opposition involvement is very limited. But yet the government is claiming that this has turned into a political uprising now, with a political motive, and this has to be dealt with within as a political political situation. And that's why there is now the situation of a face-off between the political party, which is the ruling political party, and the protesters.
I mean, as I was saying at the top, it seems like the government has really cracked down in terms of restricting internet use, shutting down businesses, schools, and so on. I mean, how difficult is ordinary life there? If you're not on the streets as a student, can you get on with your normal day-to-day?
No, absolutely not. You're right, because from today there is a indefinite curfew. There is no lifting of the curfew. There is a total internet shutdown, and people are in fear. There is no way of communicating with anybody right now. So now it is a total blackout situation, and yet through different methods, the protesters are kind of moving their program forward. So now today is one of the biggest programs so far they have announced is the March to Dhaka. And now they have asked people from all over the country to march towards Dhaka. And that is creating a lot of apprehension and anxiety that what kind of retaliation that will bring, given that there is a curfew. And these protesters are essentially, breaking the curfew. So it's quite critical and uncertain at this moment.
So Hasina's ruled the country for more than 15 years. She returned to power for a fourth consecutive term in January. That election was boycotted by her main opponents. Does she retain the support of her own party, and can she weather this storm?
I think she has support within her party, and her party still thinks that there are ways to get out of this crisis. But if we actually look at the overall mood of the country and what kind of support this mass uprising has amassed, then we can see that the support for the regime within the people is very, very low. But Hasina still has support within the key elite section of the country, one being the law enforcement agency, the civil service, and also the army is also probably has some kind of support in the top level of the army. So these forces are still, in a way, for helping the regime, but we have to see how far this goes, because now the government has kind of pulling all their power to crack down on the protesters. And if the death toll rises the way it has in the past, like 98 people dead in one day yesterday. So if the situation continues to deteriorate today as well, then probably it will be difficult for her to hold on to power.
And what happens if she loses power?
Well, there are already some form of talks within the elites of the country about what will be a transitional government, and there are talks of having an interim government, a national government made of civil society and retired judges and people like that. And there are constitutional provisions for prime minister to hand over power and to president, and then that can be followed through different mechanisms of bringing in a new interim government. So these are talks that are in right now. But unless the prime minister hands over power, it will be very difficult for the regime to go. So she has to decide. It's in her hand. She has to decide when is the time for her to go.
Dr. Ishrat Hossain, thank you very much indeed. This is The Globalist. It's 2:13 in Washington, 7:13 here in London. Democratic presidential nominee Kamala Harris is expected to announce her pick for vice president early this week. Well, for anyone who thinks the VP doesn't matter, have a listen to this.
I am childless, I have cats. I am the biggest nightmare of this J.D. Vance. I am a lady who loves her pets. They are good for taking care of all the rats. I am woman, this is cat. We are an item and together we are brats. Get out your notebook, we have a quote. In November we are all going to vote.
That's Alina Bock, and it's just one example of the enormous public reaction there has been to the Republican vice presidential nominee J.D. Vance, who complained about childless cat ladies. Well, I'm joined now by Natasha Lindstad, who's Professor of Government at the University of Essex. Natasha, that's pretty fabulous, isn't it?
It's pretty crazy, yeah. But I think you could say J.D. Vance was asking for it.
Well, I mean, that one comment has had an outside reaction and it's really focused attention on Vance. Why do you think that hit a particular nerve?
It's really interesting. I just think it's just so vicious to attack people that don't have children, that don't want to have children, or that cannot have children, and to portray them as if they're this sort of lonely, sad people. And that's alienating a big chunk of the American public because, you have a lot of women that haven't had children yet that are going to vote. I'm not sure who was he trying to appeal to. I mean, it wouldn't really even be appealing to men either to call women cat ladies. So it hit a nerve, and you could see that the Trump team didn't do a particularly good job vetting J.D. Vance because of all these different quotes are kind of coming out of the woodworks where he's just had a history of attacking people that don't have families, essentially. And he kind of tries to say, well, it's because he's pro-family, not anti people that don't have families. But he's really doubled down on his comments instead of just saying, I'm sorry.
So Kamala has been interviewing candidates. Can her pick, whoever it is, rival that for attention?
That's a really good question. So because the Democrats didn't have the traditional type of primary, it's almost as if the vice presidential pick has become a primary in itself. And there's just been a lot of excitement on the Democratic side of who is Kamala Harris going to pick. And so you keep hearing different names coming out here, whether it's, the governor of Pennsylvania, Josh Shapiro, governor of Minnesota, Tim Walz, or senator of Arizona, Mark Kelly. Those are the three names that she's apparently vetting the most closely. And whoever she picks, there will probably be some controversy, some excitement behind whoever the pick is. We're hearing a little bit about Democratic infighting at the moment and about who she should choose. Some of the liberal progressive wing of the Democratic Party do not want her to choose either Josh Shapiro or Mark Kelly and are hoping for Tim Walz. But it's up to her to choose someone who she thinks she has the most chemistry with and who she thinks has the best chance of winning.
And is it important to her that they'll also deliver a swing state?
So if it is important that they deliver a swing state, then she would have to go with Josh Shapiro, because that's actually one of the few, let's say, swing state polls where she's a little bit behind in the state of Pennsylvania. And he's a popular governor in Pennsylvania. He actually has somewhere around 60% approval rating, which would be really high, given that at the moment Trump is leading Harris in Pennsylvania, depending on the polls. That would bring a lot to the electoral map. So if that's something she cares about, I think she would go with him. That would be who I think she's going to go with anyways. But we're hearing a lot of momentum behind Tim Walz just because he's sort of this plain-speaking, incredibly likable guy, and he's went viral for referring to Trump and the Republicans as just plain weird in response to the cat lady comments.
I mean, in terms of this weirdness, Trump had a rally in Atlanta this weekend, which was really quite odd. He, at times, I felt, was hardly coherent.
When he's in a corner, he becomes completely unhinged and angry. And he was talking about the fact that he was the victim of electoral fraud, and he was spending a lot of time actually criticizing Republicans, Georgia Governor Brian Kemp and Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger, because he said they didn't want him to win. And he said, I only like people who like me. And then again, he tried to diminish Kamala Harris by making fun of her heritage. He claimed that there were 19 different ways to pronounce Kamala. I'm not sure how you interpret that other than sort of misogynistic with racist undertones there. And then he also capped it by saying, well, Vladimir Putin got a much better deal in the exchange of prisoners. So his campaign was just completely caught off balance when Harris stepped in. And he struggled to really come up with talking points that would resonate with voters. And he needs to do that. He's got 46% support that has not moved at all. It hasn't changed no matter what happens to him. He has to get above that, and he'll have to find talking points that would really be more appealing to those that are sort of in the middle.
I mean, because it did seem extraordinary to go to Atlanta and then attack the governors of the state that he's in at that time. Just looking at Kamala Harris herself as vice president, she did stay largely under the radar. But in that role, what do you think have been her successes and her failures that, of course, Trump will and has been criticising?
So the main things that Trump has been criticizing has been the fact that, and he's sort of erroneously labeled her the immigration czar. And she's not the immigration czar. She was actually just tasked with trying to find the root causes of, the immigration crisis. That's the main thing that they keep hammering over and over again, or they'll keep calling her some kind of left-wing, liberal that is out of touch with the rest of the country, something along those lines. But she has had some strengths to her and things that she's been able to accomplish during her administration as vice president. They've been able to reduce credit card late fees from $32 to $8. They've reduced junk fees at the banks to save Americans $5.5 billion annually. They've eliminated airline junk fees that have been saving Americans $500 million million annually as well. So she's been trying to take on predatory companies and protect Americans from that. And that kind of comes from her role as a prosecutor. That's something that she did while she was Attorney General in the state of California as well.
And finally, when will her pick of VP be announced?
We keep hearing it's going to be announced by tomorrow. So we have to stay tuned for that. And it would happen, I guess, before the August 7th date. Maybe she'll push it back towards them. But it looks like she's already made her decision, I think. And she's just doing sort of these final chemistry tests to just figure that out. But
Natasha, thank you very much indeed. That's Natasha Lindstedt there. Now, still to come on the programme.
I'm Emma Nelson, and I'll be joining the Globalist a little later to tell you more about how to build an identity for an Olympic city without using sport. Because in Monocle in Paris today, my guests will show how Parisian retail, branding and design are using the Games as a springboard for their work.
This is The Globalist.
UBS has over 900 investment analysts from over 100 different countries.
Over 900 of the sharpest minds and freshest thinkers in the world of finance today.
To find out how we could help you,
contact us at ubs.com.
Well, let's continue now with today's newspapers. And joining me down the line is Navina Couture, Monocle's Nairobi correspondent. Navina, good morning to you.
Good morning, Georgina.
Have you been looking at what's going on here in Britain? I believe the largest riots in 13 years. Tell us more.
Yes, I have to say this is a story that's also been picked up in the European papers. I'm in Berlin right now. Downing Street has confirmed that there will be an emergency response meeting today after more than 150 people were arrested who are accused of having taken part in violent disorder and torching hotel housing asylum seekers in the city of Rotherham in the UK. The Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, had to address the nation yesterday saying that the far-right thugs, as to quote him, will regret their actions, that the government will pursue prosecution against them. And I think a big question is how to handle the fact that the person who is being accused of stoking the riots from Cyprus, how he will be, whether he will be arrested and whether he will be prosecuted.
And of course, this all arose on false information.
Yes, exactly. It arose on false information, but it resulted in around 700 people gathering outside a Holiday Inn Express in Rotherham, clashing with police there. Rioters hurled pieces of wood, bottles and chairs. And it took, I think, several hours to get this escalating violence that also happened in other cities under control.
And it's extraordinary what they're shouting for, of course, is for all migrants to go. And as you say, this is being stoked from abroad. There are people like Tommy Robinson, even the the head of the Reform Party, Nigel Farage, who's been notably quiet in the last few hours, but certainly jumped in there right at the beginning.
Yes, exactly. Very inflammatory language. And from what I understand, a lot of this is coming from social media posts, what has been described as inflammatory online posts from, as you say, Tommy Robinson, who is apparently in Cyprus. He left the country earlier last week after a judge issued an arrest warrant. And the question, I think, is also how to get these things under control once they have escalated already on social media.
Yeah. Yesterday, I thought that I would check out what was happening at the Central Mosque in Regent's Park. I walked past with my dog. It was completely quiet, not even a police presence. Then on my way back, there was this absolute huge crowd of people flooding past. My heart sank. Then I realised they were of all races and they'd just come out of Lord's cricket ground. It was a very happy crowd.
Yeah, that's, I guess, London for you. Very impressive, actually.
Absolutely. Let's turn our attention to Israel and Lebanon. Of course, on a complete knife edge, everybody reporting that nobody knows when this is going to blow, but they feel that it will quite soon.
Yes, according to the US news website Axios, they are reporting that Secretary of State Tony Blinken told his counterparts from the G7 countries that the attack or a retaliation by Hezbollah in Iran might come as early as today. The US is sending they have sent the commander of Central Command, General Michael Kurilla, to Israel today. He's being expected there today to finalize preparations with the IDF ahead of a possible attack. The Jordanian foreign minister is on his way to Tehran. He might have actually arrived there by now. It's the first visit in a decade because Jordan is concerned that Iranian missiles will pass through its airspace. So a lot of diplomatic activity ahead of something that now seems inevitable.
And just looking at what happened in Gaza and Israel over the weekend, we've seen attacks on 2 schools and also on a hospital complex.
Yes, exactly. I think that's the other issue, that the conflict between Israel and Gaza is continuing as this wider conflict seems to be escalating. I think it's already clear that what is happening between Iran, Hezbollah, and Israel is kind of taken the attention of not just the media coverage, but also most diplomats, I think, are now trying to prevent a wider war in the region. But as you say, these attacks are continuing.
Peace talks collapsed in Cairo this weekend.
Yes, exactly. There is no news of any kind of restraint, or I think the question now is really how big an attack it could be, whether it is just symbolic to retaliate for the killing in Iran and the killing in Beirut, or whether this is going to be more aggressive than the last retaliation.
And we've seen the US, we've seen France, we've seen Britain and other countries all telling their nationals they must leave Lebanon now while they still can.
Yes, exactly. There is, I think, quite a broad call for people to leave Lebanon. I think it's interesting that there are people, observers in Lebanon, Lebanese, who are pointing to the fact that Lebanese, who very often are dual passport holders, a lot of them have decided to stay or go back to Lebanon to support their families at a time of crisis, pointing to the fact that the country has been through so many crises that they don't feel the need to run away. But I think we have to see how bad it gets.
Let's have a look at Venezuela, because, of course, those protests are continuing. That's against the vote, their Sunday's presidential election. The opposition, that is, and indeed many European countries now are demanding that Maduro releases those final vote tallies.
Yes, exactly. In the European Union, France, Germany, Italy, Spain, the Netherlands, Poland and Portugal have openly urged the Venezuelan government to release these tally sheets. I'm quoting now from the European Union statement that was issued last night, saying that despite its own commitment, the National Electoral Council has not yet published the official voting records, and that without evidence to support them, the results published on the 2nd of August cannot be recognized. I think that's quite an important statement. Any attempt to delay the full publication of the voting records will only cast further doubt on the credibility of the official published results. So I think the European Union now being much more vocal about the need to be transparent in Venezuela and calling into question Nicolas Maduro's declaration of that he won the election.
Now, you're in Germany at the moment. I wonder how you're finding the trains and what it is that Süddeutsche Zeitung says about them.
Yes, look, I've been here for a month. I've been in Europe for a month. I have been on several trains, I have to say. I use the German railway system. I use the National Rail in the UK, and I use the Eurostar. The Eurostar comes on top. The National Railway rail system here is under a lot of attack. Pretty much everyone you meet will complain about the Deutsche Bahn. Even people who don't actually use the Deutsche Bahn, who are driving, will talk about how bad it is. I kind of wonder whether it is a symptom of Germans talking something that is actually functioning down. But there are reports of every second train being delayed. I don't think it helps at a time when the government is trying to convince people to drive less and use the Deutsche Bahn more. But now Süddeutsche Zeitung has published a feature speaking to people who work for Deutsche Bahn, who are saying saying that they're embarrassed for their employer every single day, that they are stressed and that they are struggling to function. So I think the sentiment that is voiced by people using Deutsche Bahn seems to be reflective of what's happening inside the company.
Mm-hmm. Finally, let's go to Switzerland and the NZZ. This could be disaster for Swiss chocolate.
Yes, I think it is very controversial, and I think there's a huge pushback. The Swiss government, the federal government, is considering restricting advertisement targeting children. It's looking at advertising, it's looking at restrictions advertising fatty, sugary and salty foods towards children based on WHO recommendations. As you said, it is the land of chocolate and Nestle. I think processed food is very present in Switzerland as it is in other countries in Europe. It looks like roughly a fifth of children between 5 and 19 are now considered overweight and obese. But there has been a lot of pushback also in the Swiss press against these plans. I think we have to see if they go through.
Navina, thank you very much indeed. That's Navina Couture there. Now, here's what else we're keeping an eye on today. Ukrainian pilots have started flying F-16s for operations within the nation, President Volodymyr Zelensky said on Sunday, confirming the long-awaited arrival of the US-made fighter jets more than 29 months after Russia's full-scale invasion of the country. Ukraine's top commander welcomed their arrival, saying it would save the lives of Ukrainian soldiers. However, Russia has been targeting bases that may house the jets and vowed to shoot them down. North Korean leader Kim Jong-un oversaw the delivery of 250 new tactical ballistic missile launchers to frontier troops, the state media KCNA reported today, which Seoul said he would use to threaten South Korea. The launchers have been described by state media as a modern tactical attack weapon personally designed by Kim and ready to be transferred to Korean People's Army units on the frontier with the South. And a new wave of anti-immigration rioting has swept across several British cities following the murder of 3 girls in Stockport. The riots sprang up after false information on social media spread that the subject was a radical Muslim migrant. British Prime Minister Keir Starmer condemned what he described as far-right thuggery and said perpetrators would face the full force of the law after days of violent anti-immigration protests culminating in hotels housing migrants being targeted. This is The Globalist. Stay tuned. Nationwide protests against Nigeria's rising cost of living continued over the weekend. Demonstrators have clashed with police, prompting authorities to enforce curfews across several northern states. Well, Annie Adoye is our West African correspondent. Anu, many thanks for joining us. I wonder if you could tell us what's happening and what sparked this unrest.
Well, thank you for having me. There's been protests in Nigeria since August 1 nationwide. So that's in pretty much every state of the country and in all the major cities. Nigeria has been experiencing its worst economic crisis in 3 decades. Inflation is at 34%. And, most of this is a result of some of the economic reforms that the president has been bringing over the past year, such as devaluing the currency a couple of times and removing very popular but costly fuel subsidies. And I think because, Nigerians are feeling the pinch, people have decided they are going to take to the streets to protest against some of these measures.
And what happened over the weekend?
Over the weekend, there were protests across the country, in the capital, Abuja, on Saturday. And yesterday, we had the president make his first remarks since the protest began. And mostly what he said was he wants an end to the protest, that he described the protest as having a political agenda of some sort, and said that he's trying his best and that the reforms will work in due course. But he kind of did not accede to any of the demands of the protesters, who are calling for the return of some sort of subsidies, especially with the fuel prices.
So we've seen similar protests in Kenya and Uganda, largely driven by youthful demonstrators and promoted on social media. Are these related?
In a way, yes. People in Nigeria particularly have been inspired by what they saw in Kenya's protest against tax rises over there. These protests, for example, was mostly organized on social media. Like most protests in Nigeria, it has a hashtag of its own, and bad governance in Nigeria. And I think, yes, people, not just in Nigeria, but across the continent who have grievances against their government are taking inspiration from one part of the continent or another.
Well, yes, let's have a look at Southern Africa, because the Southern African Development Community, or SADC, is planning its next meeting in Zimbabwe. But now the Democratic Alliance Party of South Africa, who's recently joined the government, is demanding a change of venue, saying that holding the meeting in Harare would show endorsement of the state-sponsored clampdown on pro-democracy activists. I wonder if you could tell us more. What's the ZANU-PF government up to in Zimbabwe, and how much of a game changer would it be for an African body to finally stand up to the ZANU-PF leadership and say no more?
Yeah, the ZANU-PF, they've been in power for more than 4 decades now, pretty much since Zimbabwe won its independence. Firstly under Robert Mugabe and now under Emmerson Mnangagwa. For a long time, they have been accused of repressing activists, opposition politicians, journalists. And as you say, there's always been this sense that African bodies, including the African Union and also SADC, which South Africa is the big country in, has not been forceful enough in denouncing ZANU-PF's actions. Over the past week or so, we've seen arrests of demonstrators in Zimbabwe. And I think it's very instructive that the DA, which used to be an opposition party in South Africa and now is part of the government of national unity, is calling for South Africa to take a stand. To be honest, I'm not quite sure that's going to happen, because there's long been frustration that South Africa has not done enough to curtail the excesses of its northern neighbor, Zimbabwe. So it will be very interesting to see if it happens, but I'm not quite sure it will happen.
So just taking a continent-wide look at this, I wonder why all of these separate protests are happening now. And if it's because this is a youthful demographic, Africa has one of the youngest populations in the world, they're no longer enthralled to the politics of liberation. It's over 40 years from the end of colonialism in most places. The freedom fighters, the first independent leaders, are no longer as powerful as they once were. And is this perhaps leading to something that might be an African Spring?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question, in that, as you say, loads of people are not beholden to the liberation movements anyway. If you look at in South Africa, for example, where in the most recent elections, the ANC lost its majority for the first time, there's loads of young people, the so-called born-free generation who were born after 94, for whom they know the history of apartheid, but they did not live through it. And so they are not as beholden to those movements. It's similar in countries like Zimbabwe, where people have long-standing frustrations with the government. And I think ultimately it's a question of how organized people who want to protest are. Are we going to see more and more protests? I think so, because I think ultimately there is a sense of, hopelessness, if you will. And there's a sense that people have decided they don't really have that much to lose anymore. In Nigeria, for example, although the protests have been youth-led, we've seen something where there's middle-aged people joining the protests. Older people in the older demographic are also joining. And I think this is because, economic concerns don't have any regard for your age or your ethnicity. Everyone is pretty much feeling the pinch. And so, it's, there is, as I say, they're mostly youth-driven, but I think there's also other people in these countries who have had it with their governments.
Anu, thank you very much indeed. That's Anu Adeoye. You're with Monocle Radio.
UBS is a global financial services firm with over 150 years of heritage. Built on the unique dedication of our people, we bring fresh thinking and perspective to our work. We know that it takes a marriage of intelligence and heart to create lasting value for our clients. It's about having the right ideas, of course, but also about having one of the most accomplished systems, and an unrivaled network of global experts. That's why at UBS, we pride ourselves on thinking smarter to make a real difference. Tune in to The Bulletin with UBS every week for the latest insights and opinions from UBS all around the world.
It's 9:40 in Athens, 8:40 in Zurich. There are record numbers of tourists visiting Greece this summer, and the influx is prompting concern from authorities and residents. Well, I'm joined now in the studio by Manos Papavasiliou, who is Monocle's newsletter editor and our resident Greek in the office.
Georgina.
Hi, thank you so much for getting up early and coming into the studio. What's different in Greece this summer?
So, as we see in Greece this summer, it's experiencing record numbers of tourism. Actually, to put it in numbers, just to start with it, is there's been a recent survey conducted by the National Bank of Greece, and this year we are expecting in Greece 35 million arrivals. And that is unprecedented. I mean, in Greece, tourism is the main thing. It's the main source of income. And actually, this is a good thing because they're also expecting them to bring 22 billion euros in revenue, which is significant. And, you know, the phenomenon is not exclusive to Greece. As we've seen in southern Mediterranean countries, this over-tourism is everywhere. We've seen it in Portugal, Spain, Italy. It's not specifically that people all over the world just woke up and discovered Greece as a country to go.
What's the government suggested and how have residents reacted to that suggestion?
So the government is quite happy about it. So Kyriakos Mitsotakis, the Prime Minister, in a previous interview that he had done, I think in February, he was being asked about the effects of climate change, for example, and the warming of the country. And he specifically said that this is a good thing because it means that high season in Greece will be extended from April up until October. And we can expect more and more tourists to come to Greek islands and populate them. However, the problem with the government and with the state is that we don't have the infrastructure to house them. And as a result, high number of tourists come, they up the prices in all the islands, and locals are feeling quite, isolated in them.
And so the government's saying maybe have a staycation.
They say the staycation. This as a term, staycation is something that has been used by other countries, like, travel within your own means. The problem with Greece is that, for example, in the island of Santorini, let's take it, the mayor has issued a prompt to all citizens via social media that you should stay at home because they're waiting for so many tourists there that they cannot actually have the infrastructure to deal with them. Residents are quite furious, which, from the part of the government, they're not doing much because for them tourism is a good thing. In the long term, it can help the economy. But with rising temperatures, with 40 degrees outside, people just want to go to the islands. They just want to have holidays. They're not thinking about the future. They're thinking about the now. And to take, statements like stay at home, or we've had like some prominent journalists coming out on TV and saying Greeks should do their patriotic duty by not going holidays in August and July, but instead they should make way for tourists to do this, and Greeks should go for holidays in September or April. It has prompted a lot of bad reactions.
I wonder how tourists and residents interact with each other.
The thing with Greece is it's a very welcoming place to go on holidays. The issue that people are thinking, apart from the influx of tourists that is happening this summer, is will they come back? Because as we can see, like specifically in Santorini, in Mykonos, we have images this summer of people overpopulating spots. As a result, they're thinking maybe the brands will be lost. So if you see a lot of images of in Santorini of people crowding to each other to watch the sunset, it completely destroys the idea of bringing more in the next year. And on the other hand, there are a lot of people in Greece who think nostalgically of the time where you just take your holidays, you book a ferry, and you go to an island, whichever island you want. So there's a problem there. It's a very good thing, tourism, for Greece. As I said previously, tourism is the main income that we have in the country. But is it a double-edged sword?
Mm-hmm. And you talked about Spain, where we've seen protests against tourists. They've been targeted directly. Is Greece at that point?
Greece is not at that point at the moment, because everyone knows, and everyone is everyone knows that this is our source of income. Like in Spain, in Italy, in Portugal, we've seen protests, but at the same time, they know that there are other things that the countries do, like there's industry, they export things. In Greece, we know that tourism is our main income. And so people are not at the point yet of protesting against this. However, as I said, they're quite aware that this might destroy their lives in the long term.
And I just wonder quickly, people are saying in response to tourists in Spain being harassed and made to feel unwelcome, that Spanish tourists should no longer be allowed to go to the rest of Europe. But I wonder if there's another way, if we could perhaps have an agreement where a certain amount of people just agree to swap countries for the holidays. So the Spanish come to Britain, the Brits go to Spain, the Greeks go to, I don't know, Croatia. You could do it, right?
I mean, that's a great idea, but you know what's the thing with Greeks is that they love Greece so much that they're not such travelers. It's not like the Spanish tourists, it's not like the Italian visitors who travel. Greeks just want to go to Greece. They just want to go to their islands. And it's a great thing. I think the long-term solution of what should happen is that the government should start investing more in infrastructure. They should wake up and say, look, we want this over tourism, but we should make it available for everyone. We should build more. We should put more money into those islands. Given that we're getting more money from them now, we should put something back, build more houses, build more hotels, build more hospitality, invest in it. Make it so that they can come. And at the same time, there are authorities like, for example, Santorini, as I mentioned before, that they're considering some caps in ferries. So you can make it into an island that is beautiful again. Doesn't have as many tourism. You can have visitors all year. You can have a certain revenue coming from them, but caps, I think, is the way forward.
Manos, thank you very much indeed. That's Manos Papavasiliou. And this is The Globalist on Monocle Radio. Right, it's time to talk tech news with Josh Coles, a consultant and a writer about technology policy. Josh, it's lovely to have you back on the show. Now, there are debates about OpenAI and whether they should release a cheating detection tool. Tell us more.
Yeah, good to be here. So this is the story that OpenAI is, as you say, considering whether to release a tool that they've developed which would allow people like teachers and educators to be able to tell if, say, an essay submitted by a student was written with the help or maybe even solely using OpenAI, using ChatGPT, which is OpenAI's famous chatbot. It's divided opinion, I think, both internally and externally. I think OpenAI is keen to keep the loyalty of its younger users who may be relying on the software to help with their essays and other aspects of schoolwork. But equally, I think there's pressure from teachers to really allow greater oversight of how exactly students are using this really powerful technology.
And so what might be a downside of flagging cheating, particularly perhaps for non-English speakers?
Yeah, so aside from just, as I say, losing the loyalty of the younger users, it's been suggested that this might disproportionately affect people for whose language isn't English as their first language, which might affect the ability of the technology to work in those cases. I mean, it's worth saying a little bit about how this would work. So it's a process called watermarking, which has already been quite successfully used for AI-generated images. But the proposal here is to apply a similar principle to text. So basically, you create a passage of text, from the ChatGPT software. And although it's imperceptible to the human eye, if that was fed into this detection system, they would potentially be able to flag it. But of course, the consequences of that going wrong and having an error associated with it is terrible for the student, because they get accused wrongly of cheating. So you'd want to make sure this watermarking is very watertight to be effective.
Now, the US Commerce Department is expected to propose a ban on the use of Chinese-made software in autonomous vehicles. Tell us more.
That's right. This is interesting. So, as you say, the US Commerce Department is apparently going to be bringing these rules out in the coming weeks. Obviously, we've seen lots of new restrictions placed on different aspects of Chinese technology in the West in recent years. Think, of course, about the limits on the semiconductor chips that can be used in China, and also the UK ripping Huawei out of its 5G network. So this is clearly something which policymakers are taking very seriously, and it's actually reached a bit of a consensus in Washington about this kind of threat. But as you say, this latest set of rules concerns autonomous vehicles. And although I think it's easy to think that they've been stuck in sci-fi novels for decades now, I can tell you actually went in an autonomous vehicle in San Francisco recently, which was quite strange. It did work, it didn't crash, but suffice it to say that the technology is here, and it does seem to be rolling out onto the roads pretty soon. So the fact that the US has intervened in this to prevent Chinese technology being used in that, I think, is quite significant.
And this is not just privacy concerns, it's about safety too. It could be hacked, it could be misused, it could be a political tool.
That's right. There's loads of upsides, of course, to autonomous vehicles, obviously freeing up time in the car and potentially being more efficient as well in terms of energy. But as you say, the downsides are, it's really increasing the vulnerability to kind of systemic risks. And we've seen in recent weeks how reliant we all are on large-scale infrastructure. And if you start plugging more and more things that we use in everyday life onto the grid, that does make it a bit more susceptible both to sort of privacy, listening to people in the car, for example, but also much more dangerous potential national security risks about, those cars going haywire if they were hacked. So I can see why they're taking this quite seriously.
Now, we all want a well-turned-out and efficient assistant, but what a status symbol it would be if Dame Judi Dench, was your secretary. Tell us more.
That's right. So Meta is, of course, the company which owns Facebook and is increasingly investing in AI, is planning to roll out its own digital assistant in the coming months. We've, of course, seen many of these from different companies. And their plan is to try to make their assistant a bit more personal and familiar by using voices such as apparently Dame Judi Dench as one of the voices of their chatbot, alongside some other younger celebrities as well. It's an interesting move, isn't it, to try to make these very interesting autonomous tools feel a bit more familiar to us. Of course, this can go wrong. So earlier this year, we saw OpenAI get in a bit of hot water for releasing a tool with a voice that sounded a great deal like the actress Scarlett Johansson, who had, of course, starred in the sci-fi movie Her, which is a lot of similarities to the chatbots of today. So OpenAI had to eventually take that voice down, and Johansson has criticised the company for that, for not getting her consent for seemingly using her voice. And so this is something that companies are really trying to get right. And I think Meta's approach here is to simply throw money at the problem and try to get licensing deals with these actresses and actors.
I mean, there's a lot of friction, isn't there, between Silicon Valley and Hollywood?
That's right. This has been rolling on for a few years now. Last year, Hollywood writers and actors went on strike. And one of their demands was to make sure that studios and other production companies couldn't use their likenesses either in kind of image or voice without their consent and potentially without compensating them for that. And so I think it seems like we're reaching a place now where there is some scope for licensing deals to be reached rather than just for voices to be potentially appropriated. And so that might be bearing some fruit now with the fact that Meta is simply reaching out and offering these actors lots of money in order to voice their products.
Josh, thank you very much indeed. I should just note there, my voice is absolutely available for hire. You're listening to The Globalist on Monocle Radio. Finally, let's head to Paris to join the Monocle team there, who are in place to bring you 2 weeks of live radio. We're halfway through that now, from the heart of the Olympic city. Emma Nelson joins me now from Maison Alliance to tell us what will be in the show at the top of the hour. But before you do, Emma, would you be an AI voice?
Do you know? No, I don't think I would. Because if I don't have control of, one could say I barely have control of what I say. But if I don't have control of what I say, then I could say anything, Georgina, and that would just be scandalous. Bonjour, by the way. Good morning.
Bonjour. Good
From
morning.
the 16th floor of Maison Alliance. We're back into full sunshine, full sauna again. So please do forgive me if by the end of the programme I sound a little warm. AI probably wouldn't do that, I suppose. But I'm joined by the Deputy Head of Radio of Monocle Radio, Tom Webb, to fill us in. Good morning, Tom. About we had quite a busy athletics weekend, not participating but observing.
We did. I do also want to say my voice is also for hire for those people listening. Emma, you chucking your hat in the ring?
Oh yes, let's all go for it. That's fine. We'll come as a team. You can hire us as a gang.
Yeah. So athletics. I think I thought I'd seen every single spectacle on the planet until you walk in to a full capacity stadium for the Olympic Games and just seeing the rings on the track. It was the most wonderful atmosphere, of course, the home crowd. France with all of their flags. There was a huge delegation from the Netherlands, particularly for their hurdler, who's called Bol, who was absolutely supreme. A very, very good experience, though the big talking point was the preparations behind, let's say, the hurdles before we go into the hammer throw. The hurdles is more of a ballet, the setup of not just the 110 metres, but the 400 metres, where they are perfectly laid out the whole way around the track. And they are composed by a man in a cowboy hat. And everything about it, from the moment that it is put down, it's lowered, it's measured, it's something so beautiful that Lily Austin, standing next to me, the studio manager, thinks that she could be the hurdler composer for LA.
Yes, you have this coordinated effort that each set of hurdles has its own person with their own trolley. And they don't just go and pick the hurdles up and put them in the trolley. They have to be in sync, basically. So everybody picks up the same hurdle at the same time, according to their station. It was actually. Yeah, it was a bit distracting.
I've got to say,
that's a problem, Georgina. You're interested in the logistics rather than the.
It sounds a little bit
else that's going on.
It sounds a little bit insane, but I know that you're going to have lots and lots of time to explain actually how that works and what happened and what a very busy weekend you had in Paris, and particularly how Paris is marketing itself. When you join us at the top of the hour, we've got an hour of you, Tom, Lily, and all of your guests to unpick all of that. But Emma, I know before you go that there is one thing that has been of great interest to both you and I, and that is a member of the French pole vaulting team and, his member.
Yes. So yesterday we talked about this on Monocle on Sunday. There's a gentleman called Anthony Amirati, and he got quite a lot of attention because when he was on the men's pole vault final at the Olympics, it appears that how did I say it yesterday? This gentleman knocked the bar off, and as a result, he missed out on a medal. There's quite a lot of speculation now that actually it wasn't the gentleman's gentleman; it was the shin and the knee, which is actually quite sad because the internet would sort of argue otherwise.
But there's
and there's
video
been far too many
evidence.
slow motion creations of what
I mean,
happened to
not
him.
that I've watched it in slow-mo several
it's
times.
It's a bit of a thing. So it's a bit of a news update on that, on the biggest story of the day.
But the point is, there is evidence out there, and it is slowed down, and one can watch it again and again and again.
For absolutely hours, if one chooses, and maybe no one's looking at the shin or the knee.
I would say, Emma, we're very much looking forward to having you and the gang back on our airwaves in just a couple of minutes' time. So thank you very much indeed. And that's all we have time for on today's show. Thanks also to our producers, Angelica Jobson, Chris Chermack and Paige Reynolds, our researcher, Sana Jumani, and our studio manager, Mariella Bevan. Coming up at the top of the hour, as I say, we'll cross to Monocle in Paris, and Emma is there ready to steer the ship. The briefing is live at midday in London, and of course we'll have the Daily from Paris at 1800, that's London time. The Globalist will return at the same time tomorrow. I'm Georgina Godwin. Thank you for listening.